Hello everybody and welcome to this first introductory lesson for the AQA A-Level History module, Democracy and Nazism, Germany between 1918 and 1945. What we're going to do in this first introductory video is explain the A-Level History options. We will talk about what this option specifically offers for students who are studying it, specifically looking at the module itself, and then think about the scope of this series of lessons in line with the specification for this particular module. We will look at the specification, and this will guide us along the lessons that we are going to be looking at over the next few weeks and months. So, as a basic introduction to the A-Level in history, the AQA A-Level History requires that there be both sufficient depth and breadth in the study of a particular subject. The specification requires that students study the history of more than one country or state, including at least one outside of the British Isles. This means that you have to study two particular areas of subject for your exams, one of which will have to be a study of the British Isles, and then by extension the other one has to be a subject that is not anything to do with the British Isles. Aspects of history that have to be in breadth and in depth. So you do two papers. One of them is a breadth paper that covers quite a large range of historical time and chronology. One is a depth paper that deals with a much shorter time frame. And also a range of appropriate historical perspectives, including the likes of cultural perspectives, economic, ethnic perspectives, political perspectives, and religious perspectives. Specifically then for Democracy and Nazism then, Democracy and Nazism is a depth paper. It is a paper 2 module, specifically 2.0, and this means that you are dealing with a shorter period of history than the breadth paper that you find in paper 1. So the history time period for Democracy and Nazism is at the end of the First World War in 1918 all the way through to the end of the Second World War in 1945. So sort of 30 or so years. Now, in paper 2, you'll be given 3 primary sources and you are asked to assess their validity with reference to a particular subject area. This is the main difference in terms of the actual content for a student when they get into the exam. In paper 1, you are asked to evaluate how convincing the arguments that are made by historians in 3 sources, 3 extracts. In paper 2, you are given 3 primary sources. These are sources that are contemporaneous to the time that you are studying. So it might be a speech by a Nazi politician, or it could be a report or a diary entry from a particular individual. And you are asked to essentially think about how valid those sources are, how useful those sources are to a historian who is studying this particular area or studying this particular topic. This means you have to not only dive into the content of the source itself, what the source actually says and how accurate that source is, but then you also have to think about the type of source it is. You have to think about when this source was written. Was it written at a time that therefore the author would not have known the events that take place afterwards? What is the purpose of the source? What is the tone of that source? All these things have to also be taken into consideration. The AQA website gives us this indication of what Democracy and Nazism provides for students. It says that they provide for the study in depth of a period of German history during which a newly developed democratic form of government gave way to a dictatorial Nazi regime. It explores political concepts such as right and left, nationalism and liberalism, as well as ideological concepts such as racialism, anti-Semitism, and social Darwinism. It also encourages reflection on how governments work and the problems of democratic states, as well as consideration of what creates and sustains a dictatorship. This is fundamentally a fascinating topic, one of the most fascinating topics in history. You are basically going to be studying the end of the First World War, which gives rise to the establishment of the Weimar Republic, a brand new democratic republic in place of the Kaiserreich, the established institutions of the Kaiser. And then we're going to think about how this collapses. Why does Weimar ultimately fail in the 1930s and give rise to the Third Reich? And then we're going to spend time thinking about the Third Reich from a variety of different perspectives, thinking about what society and economics was like in the Third Reich, and then thinking about Nazi racial policy towards certain what are known as quote-unquote undesirables, as well as Nazi anti-Semitism, before studying the position of the Third Reich during the Second World War. The position of the Second World War itself, the Nazi economy in the Second World War, society in the Second World War, and then thinking about one of the legacies of the Third Reich, which is, of course, the Holocaust in the Second World War as well. And so fundamentally then, what we're going to look at is the following topics. Part 1 deals with the Weimar Republic. This is from 1918 to 1933. We'll think about the establishment in the early years of the Weimar Republic, the sort of choppy waters, if you will, of the impact of World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, and some of the early attempts to overthrow the Republic, things like the Kapp Putsch and the Munich Putsch. We will then think about the period of relative calm, sometimes described as the golden age of the Weimar Republic. This is the period from 1924 to 1928, when everything was relatively calm, relatively speaking. We will talk about the development of high culture in this time period. We will talk about society, the impact and the role on women. We will talk about the economy, the recovery of the economy from hyperinflation in the earlier 1920s. And then we will think about how this goes from a golden age to a collapse of democracy, the rise of the Nazi Party, the NSDAP, the ideology of the Nazi Party, as well as the Communist Party, the KPD, during this time period, the appointment of Hitler as Chancellor, and the collapse of democracy by 1933. The second part, which is the A-level only part, refers to Nazi Germany itself. We will talk about the Nazi dictatorship between 1933 and 1939, the full establishment of Hitler as Führer, which is, of course, what happens as the result of the Night of the Long Knives in 1934 and the death of Paul von Hindenburg as president of the Weimar Republic in 1934 as well. And then start thinking about Nazi society, start thinking about the economy, start thinking about the role of men and women and workers and labourers during this time period. Think about the establishment of the police state, the SA, the Gestapo, the SS. And then we will start to think about, specifically in its own topic, Nazi racial policies. How did the Nazis frame social Darwinism? How did the Nazis contribute to the development of anti-Semitic policies? And how did these laws begin to formulate, if you will? So how did they get from anti-Semitic rhetoric all the way through to the genocide that we see in the Holocaust? This involves talking about things like the Nuremberg laws in 1935, the T4 program, the Nazi euthanasia program, Reich's Kristallnacht in 1938, as well as the impact of war, the impact of invading Poland, the impact of invading the Soviet Union in 1941. And then we will think about the impact of the Second World War, beginning in 1939 in Europe at least, and ending with the collapse of the Third Reich in 1945, and the impact that this had not only on the German economy, on German society, but also the impact that it had on European Jews around Eastern Europe and in Western Europe as well, with the impact of the Holocaust. Now, in terms of reading and extra reading, of course, you've got your basic textbooks for this particular module. If you're somebody who wants to go into even more depth and detail in this particular module, there are sort of two courses that I would recommend going down. The trilogy by Richard J. Evans on the Third Reich, the first of which being The Coming of the Third Reich, the second, Third Reich in Power. The third, less important, really. The Third Reich at War is a bit more of a military history, but it's still very important at the same time. My personal favourite is The Third Reich, A New History by historian Michael Burleigh. A little bit higher level, if you will, but it is one single volume of history, so that might be a useful illustration if you want to spend more time looking at some additional details. If not, then just the ordinary textbooks are always going to be very, very helpful. I hope you found this video specifically very helpful as an introduction, and I hope to see everybody in the next lessons when we start looking at the substantive content, specifically starting to look at the collapse of the Imperial German state and the establishment of the Weimar Republic.